What's everybody? I said what's everybody. I meant what's up everybody. It's the Daywalker Reporter. Here again with another video. It's early in the morning. I don't know what time it is. It's like 11:10. And I'm here to talk about a very interesting topic today. Now I'm going to leave that teacup right there because I'm talking about curation versus review, right? Let me fix up my freaking hair. It's going a little bit crazy. What's the difference between being a curator and being a reviewer? Now, for one, if you're a curator, you're going out of your way to look for new stuff so that you can reveal it to the world. You're gonna it's more so informative. It's not really, the purpose isn't to tell people your personal opinions about a show, or not even just a show, but a book or a piece of art. The whole purpose of it is that you're doing it so that people can learn about something the other eyes wouldn't have known about. And also when it comes to curation, is more so historical. It's more so about giving people, sort of an outline of what the appeal of the show is based on the time period it came out. It's very famous in the areas of art history when you got people who collect, who have these large collections at museums. That's an example of curation, right? For example, and review is a lot different than curation. With review, in a lot of those cases, you instead of focusing on just highlighting things, you give an overview of the story, and then you use a certain criteria to make judgments about said story. Now, if I were to give you a more literal and focused example of curation, um, let's use some manga from my collection that I got recently called The Times of Botchan, right? Times of Botchan is a series about a guy named Soseki Natsume. I'm pronouncing it wrong. And he's basically this author guy, and what he's doing is that it's taking place during Meiji-restoration, and it's just showing him sort of having this slight neurosis, having to process the reality of dealing with the newly changing world, which is very much different than how the world was before the restoration, with the, gotta wet my whistle, with the stuff with the shogunate and stuff like that. When that was deconstructive, anybody knows anything about that dynamic, if you've seen Rurouni Kenshin, you basically know what led to, the sort of revolution of the Imperials with the Emperor of Japan, and this stuff led into World War II stuff. We're not going to get into that. That was some pretty crazy stuff. But anyway, if I were to curate the Times of Botchan, Times of Botchan, I said the first time better, I would, just go in detail talking about the artwork, who the artwork done. The artwork is done by a guy named Jiro Taniguchi. He's big for doing slice of life, really highly detailed artwork. And then if I were to talk about the writer, his name is Natsuo Sekikawa. Now I could go into detail about the history around the production of the manga. For example, Natsuo and Jiro have worked together before. Natsuo is the writer, Jiro is the artist, right? And I would talk about the entire process of sort of that writer-artist dynamic, I would talk about how before this, Natsuo, and I keep looking down because this is recent. I just got this, so I don't remember everything about it. To do an effective curation, I'll have to do an entire series of videos about curating different series. If you want to see that, press the like button below and subscribe. But anyway, it's the same as when you're curating art. For example, if I were to curate pieces from this book, the manga prehistory book, I would talk about artist name, date of a piece, Like, for example, this piece right here. This looks pretty sick. With this piece, I would talk about the fact that it's the Daikoku figure to the lottery by Kawanabe Kyosai Hagi Urag, and I would talk about where it's located, right? I would talk about it's at the freaking Hagi Uragami Museum, right? And I would go into detail about the time period, different purposes the artist had. Now that piece doesn't necessarily have a time period attached to it, but let me give you a better example. If we talk about this piece, this piece right here. This piece by Kachiyama Kachi Mountain by Ochihai Yoshifuji in 1857 at the Tokyo Metropolitan Library. I would go into detail about that. I would tell you where the piece took place. I would tell you the artist and what I said before. I repeated that a few times because it's a little bit more objective than a review, because when you're reviewing something, you aren't necessarily going into detail about where the piece is from, the history of the piece, what the artist is like, unless how the artist's personality plays a big role in the overarching story. Stuff like that. Now, if I were to, let's go back to Botchan again, okay? If I were to give a review of Botchan, I could talk about how the fact that, like, upon the first reading, it's a little bit difficult to get into. You have to sort of read it twice to really get invested in the story. And then upon the second reading, you really fall in line, because, like, Soseki, his character is someone who is kind of has this sort of confidence issues, and he's moving into this new era, and he sees different people, like the police officer guy. I forgot his freaking name. There's a lot of names in this manga because there's a lot of characters in this manga, and you have to sort of follow the different ones of you have to follow each of them and how they deal with different situations and dynamics, and it's pretty entertaining to read. It's really interesting seeing how the different characters he meets plays a role in the formulation of his story, Botchan. And like the beginning starts with this like poetry sort of slam thing where you have this older guy who kind of says this very confusing poem, and then you have this other guy who says a pretty, like, very straightforward poem, and one of the poems is basically about socialism, and like it low key is kind of funny. And when you look at the artist details in the back, they do talk about how one of their goals was to kind of be a little bit more comical, but how this book was, advertised at the time was that it's like hard boiled or whatever. And you're just like, well, how can it be like? And then they were like, well, how can it be hard boiled if our intentions was for it to be a freaking comedy, you know? Yeah. And then I would go into detail about different things I liked about it, different things I didn't like about it. Because it's all about a criteria by which you use to judge things. Now, one of the things that sort of aggravates me about some people who review things is that they use a certain standard to base their entire, like, reviewer sense off of, that they didn't necessarily take the time to think about that standard and whether or not it was things that they actually liked. It's more so about how this can appeal to the most amount of people versus how I personally feel about it. Because even if you're using like Western criteria of how to tell a story, basic, freaking exposition, conflict, exposition, rising act, climax, freaking resolution, even if you're using that basic premise to tell a story, even if you're using that, right? It's not 100% emblematic of ways to tell stories. If you look at there are different standards of how to tell a story. If you look at like the Eastern Standard versus the Western Standard, now there isn't much of a stark separation anymore, but you can definitely see some serious motifs that separate the two. For example, over here there's a lot of emphasis on conflict. There's a lot of emphasis on this character being against this other character, or this character being against nature. But like in other forms of story writing, the dynamic is completely different, right? It's completely like, it's not really even based around conflict. It's just the characters introduced with a dynamic that's kind of confusing, and then they learn to deal with that dynamic. It's more so about including that information and learning from that dynamic versus that situation versus being in conflict with it. You know, two major examples that you can use are like some of the oldest stories told in the East and West. You got the freaking Odyssey versus the freaking Journey to the West. You know, in the Odyssey, got this guy who's going out with his group of, they aren't even his friends, they're just group of like battle partners, and he's telling, and they're going to do these different things, and like every single villain that's introduced is a freaking obstacle, and they barely have any characterization, and even his like supporting cast barely have any characterization. Their whole purpose is just to be there to serve the main character. And then you like separate that from like, you know, Journey to the West, which is completely different, where you have the characters that go into these different situations where there is conflict, and it's more so about them learning how to deal with said conflict versus like, oh, well, we're going to fight against something. Like a lot of the difference is that a lot of the characters who are villains in the Journey to the West in the beginning eventually become our main character's friend at the end of the day. So yeah, like it's very interesting. Like that's like that's like a deconstruction of like, you know, the criteria by which people use to judge things. But at the end of the day, that kind of stuff doesn't matter because it was created by people one day who were just like, okay, well, this is how I want to write our story. You can't use those standards of conflict 100% all the time. You know, some stories don't have conflict, and they can still